A 9-year-old girl. Home alone for less than an hour. Vanished without a trace. Her neighbor, an innocent man convicted twice for her murder. Destroyed by a justice system that failed at every level. And the real killer? A family friend who attended her funeral. Who comforted her grieving parents. Who walked free for 36 years. This is the story of Christine Jessop. A case that shattered a small Canadian town, exposed catastrophic failures in law enforcement, revolutionized an entire nation's justice system, and finally found resolution through cutting-edge genetic science in 2020. One murder, 2 destroyed lives, and decades of questions that demanded answers. Welcome to Cold Case Desk. Before we dive in, if you're enjoying this deep investigation into one of Canada's most notorious cold cases, please hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you never miss our documentaries. And if you appreciate the research that goes into these videos, leave a like. It truly helps the channel grow. Now, let's go back to October 3rd, 1984, in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and nobody locked their doors. Queensville, Ontario. Population, 600. The kind of place where neighbors watch each other's kids, where you can leave your bicycle in the driveway overnight, where children play in cemeteries without fear. A picturesque community just 45 minutes north of Toronto, surrounded by farmland and forests, with a single main street and a general store where everybody stops to chat. It was the kind of town where nothing bad ever happened. Until October 3rd, 1984. Christine Marion Jessop was born November 29, 1974. Her parents, Janet and Robert Jessop, called her their miracle baby. After adopting their son Kenneth 5 years earlier, they'd struggled to conceive. Then Christine arrived, and their family felt complete. She was tiny for her age. At 9 years old, Christine weighed just 40 pounds. Rail-thin with a crooked front tooth and signature low pigtails. Her mother described her as a tomboy who wouldn't hurt a fly. Her brother Kenny said she followed him everywhere, typical little sister energy. Christine loved life with an intensity that made everyone around her smile. She played baseball on local teams, rode her bicycle constantly through the quiet streets of Queensville, and absolutely adored her beagle, Freckles. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian when she grew up. Her most prized possessions were a Cabbage Patch doll that served as her confidant and a stuffed bunny named Thumper. The Jessop family lived in a 168-year-old white farmhouse on Leslie Street. Behind the house stretched a cemetery where Christine used to play among the old headstones, completely safe, completely unafraid. It was that kind of town. But the fall of 1984 brought unusual stress to the Jessop household. Robert Jessop, Christine's father, was serving an 18-month sentence at Toronto East Detention Center for misappropriation of funds. He'd stolen money from a special needs uncle. It was the kind of family secret you kept quiet in a small town. Janet told neighbors her husband was away on business. Close friends knew the truth. And Janet, working at Sears at Upper Canada Mall to support the family, was doing her best to hold everything together. Wednesday morning, October 3rd, 1984. 7 a.m. Janet Jessop picked up the phone and started making her morning calls. One of those calls went to Heather Hoover, a close family friend whose husband Calvin worked alongside Bob Jessop at Eastern Independent Telecom. During this call, Christine could be heard in the background, crying, inconsolable. She desperately wanted to go with her mother and brother to visit her father in jail. Janet told her no. 9 years old was too young for a detention center visit. Janet had no way of knowing that this phone call would seal her daughter's fate. Because Calvin Hoover was home that morning. He was in the room. He heard the conversation. He heard that Christine would be home alone after school that day. And he started planning. Brother Kenny Jessop would later say with grim certainty, "From day one, I truly believed it was someone who knew our family, knew my dad was in jail, and knew that we were going to visit him that day. That was his day to do it." Janet put Christine on the school bus that morning and waved goodbye. It was the last time she would see her daughter alive. Christine's school day at Queensville Public School was completely normal. Unremarkable. She attended her classes, laughed with friends, participated in music class. Her teacher gave her a plastic recorder, and Christine carefully taped her name onto it. She couldn't wait to show her family. During lunch, she made plans with her best friend, Leslie Chipman. They would meet at the park around 4 p.m. to play with their dolls. A typical Wednesday afternoon plan for two 9-year-old girls. The school bus dropped Christine off at 3:45 p.m. on Leslie Street. She walked to the mailbox, gathered the family mail, and headed down the long driveway to the empty farmhouse. Inside, she placed her backpack on the kitchen counter, put the mail beside it, and hung her coat on a hook in the hallway. But here's the thing. That hook was too high for Christine to reach. Someone else hung her coat there. Someone taller. Somewhere between 3:50 and 4 p.m., Christine left the house and walked to the corner store. Multiple witnesses saw her. She bought bubble gum. She was playing with her new recorder, excited, happy, completely unaware that someone was watching. She left the store after a minute or so, and then she disappeared. At 4 p.m., Leslie Chipman went to the park to meet Christine. She'd called the Jessop house earlier, but got no answer. Now she sat in the park, waiting, checking her watch, wondering where her best friend was. Christine never showed up. At 4:10 p.m., Janet and Kenny Jessop pulled into their driveway after visiting Bob at the detention center. Janet had stopped at the dentist for Kenny's toothache, then made the long drive to see her husband, then the long drive back. They walked into the house expecting to find Christine watching TV or doing homework. Instead, they found an empty house. Christine's red bicycle was lying on its side in the garage, its kickstand damaged. This was unusual. Christine always leaned her bike carefully against the freezer. She took care of her things. Her school bag sat on the counter. The mail was there. The dog, Freckles, was acting strange, anxious, pacing. But Christine was nowhere. Janet checked Christine's room, the bathroom, the basement. She called out her name. Nothing. She walked through the cemetery behind the house, thinking maybe Christine was playing among the headstones like she always did. But the cemetery was empty. By 4:30 p.m., Janet was worried but not panicked. Christine was independent for her age. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's house without asking permission. It wouldn't be like her, but kids forget sometimes. Janet started making phone calls. She called the parents of Christine's friends, asking if anyone had seen her daughter. Each time, the answer was the same. No, we haven't seen Christine since school. When Janet called Leslie Chipman, the girl explained that they'd planned to meet at the park at 4 p.m., but Christine never showed up. Leslie had waited and then gone home. That's when real fear set in. Janet and Kenny grabbed flashlights and went out searching. They walked the streets of Queensville, calling Christine's name. They checked every place she liked to go. The park, the baseball field, the cemetery, the corner store. It was getting dark. Christine had been missing for hours. And Queensville was a small town. Where could she be? At approximately 7 p.m., with no sign of Christine and no word from anyone, Janet Jessop picked up the phone and called the police. York Regional Police established a command post at the nearby fire hall. But they immediately faced serious challenges. They had only one officer for every 860 residents. No major crimes unit. Zero experience with child abductions or murders. Their inexperience showed right away. Multiple officers tramped through the Jessop house, contaminating potential evidence. A constable removed Christine's coat for inspection, handling it without gloves. The newspaper's plastic wrapping was discarded without being checked for fingerprints. Different detectives entered through different doors, tracking through areas that should have been preserved as crime scenes. But despite their mistakes, the police took the disappearance seriously. This wasn't a teenager who'd run away from home. This was a 9-year-old girl from a stable family in a town where stranger danger simply didn't exist. By dawn on October 4th, hundreds of community members had joined the search. Volunteers combed through fields and forests. Divers searched local ponds. Helicopters circled overhead. Christine's face appeared on every television set and in every newspaper. Marg Johnson, a volunteer searcher, told the Toronto Star, "We are full of anxiety and concern. There is a feeling of disbelief that something like this could happen here." On October 6th, 3 days after Christine's disappearance, authorities granted Robert Jessop compassionate release from Toronto East Detention Center. He came home to help search for his daughter, to support his devastated wife, to do something, anything, to bring Christine home. The search continued for days, then weeks, then months. Halloween 1984 saw Queensville's streets mostly empty of trick-or-treaters. Parents were terrified. If Christine Jessop could vanish in broad daylight from one of the safest towns in Canada, no child was safe. Families kept their kids indoors. The community was paralyzed by fear. Crime Stoppers offered a $1,000 reward for information. Tips poured in. People reported seeing a girl who might be Christine in a passing car. Someone thought they saw her at a gas station. Another caller claimed to have spotted her at a shopping mall. But every lead went nowhere. The police had no suspects. No evidence. No idea what had happened to Christine Jessop. At the Jessop house, Christmas arrived without celebration. No tree. Just a few presents for Kenny. Nobody felt like celebrating. How could they? Christine was out there somewhere, alive or dead, and they had no answers. December 31st, 1984. New Year's Eve. While most families were preparing to celebrate, Fred Patterson and his two daughters went looking for their missing dog near their property in Sunderland, Ontario, about 55 kilometers east of Queensville. They were hiking near Lake Scugog, following trails through wooded areas, calling the dog's name. Just off a trail bend, Patterson spotted what looked like a pile of garbage next to a half-dug pit. He walked closer to investigate. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. A badly decomposed corpse. Small, child-sized, lying on its back with legs spread in an unnatural position. Patterson immediately herded his daughters away from the scene and rushed home to call the police. When officers arrived, they quickly identified the body through the one item lying in the grass beside it. A plastic recorder with a piece of tape that read Christine Jessop. She was still wearing her beige turtleneck with blue pullover and a blouse with buttons missing. Her blue corduroy pants and Nike running shoes were found just south of her feet. One item was never recovered, her hand-knitted blue zippered sweater. The autopsy revealed Christine had suffered multiple stab wounds to the chest and upper body, some penetrating deep enough to mark the vertebrae. The pathologist determined this was the cause of death. A second autopsy would later suggest she'd been stabbed at least 200 times, with many defensive wounds indicating she'd fought bravely for her life. The medical examiner also found semen stains on Christine's underwear. She'd been sexually assaulted. This evidence would eventually identify her killer, but it would take 36 years. Reverend Bev Hall of St. Mary's Anglican Church delivered the devastating news to the Jessop family. Bob Jessop's immediate response. In a way, it is good that it is over, in a sense of not knowing. But now it is a question of who did it. Who did it? That question would consume investigators, destroy an innocent man's life, and remain unanswered for more than 3 decades. Christine Marion Jessop was buried on January 7, 1985, in the Queensville cemetery behind her house. The same cemetery where she used to play, completely unafraid, in a town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Nearly the entire community attended the funeral. Hundreds of mourners crowded into St. Mary's Anglican Church and the cemetery. Christine was laid to rest with her beloved Cabbage Patch doll, her confidant, the toy she'd shared her secrets with. Among the mourners that day was a man named Calvin Hoover, close family friend, trusted neighbor, the person who had attended Christine's memorial service and later went to the Jessop family home for the wake, offering his condolences, hugging Janet Jessop, expressing his shock and grief. Nobody knew that Calvin Hoover had listened to that phone call on October 3rd. Nobody knew he'd heard that Christine would be home alone. Nobody knew he was the last person to see Christine Jessop alive. And nobody would know for 36 years. Because police were about to focus on an entirely different suspect. A man who lived next door to the Jessops. A man whose only crimes were being awkward, eccentric, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. His name was Guy Paul Morin. And investigators were about to put him through a nightmare that would last a decade and reshape Canadian justice forever. But first, let's take a moment. If you're finding this deep dive into the Christine Jessop case compelling, please hit that like button. It helps us create more comprehensive documentaries like this. And don't forget to subscribe to Cold Case Desk for more thoroughly researched true crime content. Now, let's talk about what happens when police lock onto a suspect and refuse to see anything else. Let's talk about tunnel vision. February 14th, 1985. Valentine's Day. More than 4 months after Christine's disappearance and 3 months after her body was discovered, York Regional Police detectives returned to interview Janet Jessop once again. They asked her the same question they'd asked multiple times before. Could she think of anyone who seemed suspicious? Anyone who behaved oddly around Christine? Anyone at all? This time, Janet mentioned something she'd briefly thought about before. Her neighbor, the 25-year-old man who lived next door with his parents. She described him as a weird-type guy who played the clarinet. That single offhand comment redirected the entire investigation and set in motion one of the worst wrongful convictions in Canadian history. Guy Paul Morin was born in 1959, the only son and youngest child of Alphonse and Ida Morin. He had 4 older sisters. His father was a retired engineer from Seneca College. His mother was a retired teacher. They were a respectable, hard-working family who'd lived on Leslie Street in Queensville since 1978. Guy was, without question, eccentric. He worked as a finishing sander at a furniture company, but his real passion was music. He played saxophone and clarinet in 3 different community bands. He'd won numerous awards for his musical abilities. He loved the swing music of the 1940s and could talk endlessly about Glenn Miller and Benny Goodman. He kept bees in his parents' backyard and grew flowers specifically to encourage his hives. He still lived at home at 25, drove his parents' car, and didn't have much of a social life beyond his music. His sister Denise Kowalski would later describe him as extremely talented, but also, admittedly, a bit of a nerd. Here's what Guy Paul Morin wasn't: a criminal. He had absolutely no criminal record. Not even a speeding ticket. No history of violence. No history of anything remotely concerning. He barely knew the Jessop family. They were neighbors, sure, but they didn't socialize. Janet Jessop had occasionally asked Guy's parents to keep an eye on Christine when the family was out, but Guy himself had minimal interaction with the girl. He'd helped her catch her dog once when it ran away. That was the extent of their relationship. But when Janet mentioned him as weird, the police latched on. The FBI had provided a profile of the likely killer, an intelligent white male, Queensville resident, aged 19 to 26. Guy Paul Morin fit this description. He was 25. He was intelligent. He lived in Queensville. He played the clarinet. And Christine had a recorder with her when she disappeared. To the police, this seemed significant. Maybe Morin had used music to engage Christine in conversation. Maybe he'd shown her his clarinet, suggested they could play together. Maybe that's how he'd lured her into his car. It was a theory built on nothing but speculation. But it was enough. By February 19, 1985, police had set up surveillance on the Morin home. 3 days later, 2 York regional officers knocked on the door and asked to speak with Guy. The interview was brief. Detectives asked how well he knew Christine. Guy said they'd hardly ever spoken except for the one time her dog ran away and he'd helped her catch it. They asked where he was on October 3rd, the day Christine disappeared. Guy explained he'd been at work at the furniture factory in Scarborough, about 30 miles from Queensville. His shift ended at 3:32 p.m. He'd driven to a grocery store in Newmarket to pick up a few things. Stopped at a gas station to fill up. Then drove home, arriving around 5 p.m. His parents and sister confirmed this. They'd seen him come home, looking tired from work. He'd eaten dinner with the family and gone to bed early. It was a solid alibi. But here's the problem. The police needed Guy Paul Morin to be guilty. They'd been investigating Christine's murder for 4 months without any real leads. The FBI profile seemed to fit him. The comment about him being weird seemed significant. And now they had him in their sights. So they started building a case, piece by piece, using evidence that would later be described as essentially valueless. First, the timeline. If Guy finished work at 3:32 p.m. and drove straight to Christine's house, could he have arrived before Janet and Kenny got home? Janet had originally stated she arrived home at 4:10 p.m. She was certain of this because she'd looked at the kitchen clock immediately upon entering. But investigators kept questioning her about it. Are you sure it was 4:10? Could it have been later? Maybe 4:20? 4:30? Could you have been mistaken about the time? After months of being asked the same questions over and over, Janet began to doubt herself. The police were professionals. They knew what they were doing. If they said she might be wrong about the time, maybe she was wrong. Eventually, Janet and Kenny both adjusted their testimony. Maybe they got home closer to 4:35 p.m. This change gave Guy Paul Morin enough time, theoretically, to leave work, drive to Queensville, abduct Christine, take her somewhere, assault and murder her, dispose of her body, and return home before 5 p.m. It was an absurdly tight timeline, but it was technically possible. Barely. Next, the physical evidence. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Guy's car. In the trunk, they found several fabric fibers. These fibers were sent to the Center of Forensic Sciences in Toronto for analysis. The lead analyst was a woman named Stephanie Nyzyk. She compared the fibers from Guy's trunk to the clothing Christine was wearing when her body was found. Specifically, her blue sweater. NYZNYK concluded that the fibers could have come from the same source as Christine's sweater. Not that they definitely came from Christine's sweater. Not that they matched perfectly. Just that they could have come from the same source. This kind of language is common in forensic analysis. It's intentionally vague because fiber evidence is notoriously unreliable. Millions of sweaters are made with similar fibers. Finding a few fibers in someone's trunk that could have come from a particular sweater proves absolutely nothing. But it sounded damning in court. Then there were the hairs. Several hairs were found on Christine's clothing and body. These hairs were also sent to the Center of Forensic Sciences for comparison with samples taken from Guy Paul Morin. One hair, found on Christine's necklace, was deemed microscopically similar to Morin's hair. Again, not a match. Just similar. Human hair analysis is subjective and has since been largely discredited as unreliable. But at the time, it sounded like strong evidence. What the defense didn't know was that the Center of Forensic Sciences had serious problems with their evidence handling. In 1986, scientists at the lab discovered that evidence samples were contaminated by purplish-pink animal hairs from a technician's Angora sweater. This meant that the fiber and hair evidence used to build the case against Guy Paul Morin was potentially meaningless. It might not have come from Christine or Guy at all. It might have come from a lab technician's clothing. But the Center of Forensic Sciences didn't disclose this contamination to the defense. They kept it secret. And when questions were later raised about the evidence, the CFS claimed the samples had been lost. Conveniently, the very evidence that might have exonerated Guy Paul Morin disappeared. But the police weren't done building their case. They needed more than questionable forensic evidence. They needed someone to testify that Guy Paul Morin had confessed. Enter the jailhouse informants. On April 22, 1985, police raided the Morin home and arrested Guy as he was driving to band practice. He was charged with first-degree murder and held at Whitby Jail awaiting trial. Guy Paul Morin had never been in trouble with the law in his life. Now he was sitting in a jail cell, accused of sexually assaulting and murdering a 9-year-old child. The charges were so serious that he was denied bail. Shortly after his arrest, an undercover police officer was placed in Guy's cell. His mission: get Morin to confess. The officer spent 4 days with Guy, engaging him in conversation, trying to build trust, hoping Guy would break down and admit what he'd done. During these conversations, the officer later testified, Guy made several suspicious comments. Most notably, he supposedly said the phrase, "Red rum the innocent." Red rum. Murder spelled backwards. A reference to Stephen King's novel, The Shining, which Guy had mentioned was his favorite movie. The officer claimed this was clearly a veiled confession. Guy was speaking in code, admitting he'd murdered an innocent child. But there was a problem with this testimony. Guy Paul Morin was an awkward, eccentric man who often spoke in movie quotes and obscure references. He'd mentioned The Shining multiple times in conversation. The undercover officer had likely prompted some of these references. And after Guy's eventual exoneration, journalist Kirk Macon would write, "There can no longer be any doubt that an undercover police officer planted in his jail cell in 1985 was not telling the truth." But the fabricated confession wasn't enough. The prosecution wanted more. 2 other inmates came forward claiming they'd heard Guy confess. Robert Dean May and a man identified only as Mr. X both testified that Guy had blurted out details about Christine's murder during late-night conversations in jail. Robert Dean May had an extensive criminal history and was facing serious charges. In exchange for his testimony against Guy Paul Morin, he received leniency in his own case. He would later be diagnosed as a pathological liar. In 2001, he was declared a dangerous offender and sentenced to potentially life in prison for terrorizing women. Mr. X had a personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies and a criminal history that included sexual offenses. He'd also received a leniency deal in exchange for testimony. Years later, May told friends he'd completely fabricated Guy's supposed confession. He'd made it up to get a lighter sentence. But at the time, the jury didn't know any of this. They heard 2 separate inmates testify that Guy Paul Morin had confessed to murder. Combined with the fiber evidence, the hair evidence, the supposedly suspicious timeline, and the undercover officer's testimony, it seemed like a strong case. The trial began January 7, 1986. Defense counsel Clayton Ruby attacked every piece of evidence. He pointed out that the fiber and hair evidence was circumstantial at best. He challenged the credibility of the jailhouse informants. He highlighted the timeline problems. But Ruby also made a controversial decision. He introduced psychiatric evidence suggesting that Guy Paul Morin might have schizophrenia. The strategy was complex. If the jury believed Guy killed Christine, they should find him not guilty by reason of insanity rather than guilty of murder. It was a risky move. But Ruby was concerned that the evidence, however flimsy, might convince the jury of Guy's guilt. After weeks of testimony and less than a day of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict on February 7, 1986. Not guilty. Guy Paul Morin walked out of the courtroom a free man after 10 months in jail. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The Jessop family was devastated. Bob Jessop told reporters, "You get damn mad is what you get because you feel the system let you down." Police were furious. The media portrayed the acquittal as a miscarriage of justice. How could this weird loner who clearly killed Christine Jessop be allowed to walk free? The Crown immediately announced plans to appeal the verdict. And Guy Paul Morin, who'd just been found not guilty, returned to his parents' house in Queensville, still living next door to the family who believed he'd murdered their daughter. Life in Queensville became a nightmare for the Morin family. Someone repeatedly filled their mailbox with threatening letters. People threw objects at their house. Guy couldn't go anywhere in town without being stared at, whispered about, or openly confronted. The community had decided he was guilty, regardless of what the jury said. And the prosecution wasn't finished. On June 5, 1987, more than a year after Guy's acquittal, the Court of Appeal ordered a new trial. They argued that the trial judge hadn't properly explained the concept of reasonable doubt to the jury. It was a technicality, but it was enough to put Guy Paul Morin on trial again for murder. The second trial began May 28, 1990, and it would become the longest murder trial in Canadian history at that time, running for 9 months with 120 witnesses. Guy had a new defense lawyer, Jack Pinkowski, who fought aggressively for disclosure of police reports that hadn't been provided to the first defense team. Some of these reports pointed to viable alternative suspects that police had never fully investigated. One particularly disturbing piece of information emerged during the trial. Christine's brother, Kenneth Jessop, had told police that when Christine was 7 years old, he and 2 friends had induced her into having sexual relations with them on several occasions. This information had been in police files since shortly after Christine's murder. Yet investigators had never thoroughly explored whether Kenneth or his friends might be connected to her death. They'd remained laser-focused on Guy Paul Morin. The prosecution presented largely the same case as the first trial. The fiber evidence, the hair evidence, the jailhouse informants, the undercover officer's testimony, the supposedly suspicious timeline. But this time, a new jury heard the evidence. And this time, they reached a different conclusion. On July 30, 1992, after months of testimony, the jury found Guy Paul Morin guilty of first-degree murder. Guy stood in the courtroom and declared, "I am not guilty of this crime." His lawyer, Jack Pinkowski, responded, "Today an innocent man was found guilty." Janet Jessop's reaction was one of relief. Finally, somebody has paid for Christine. The guilty one has paid for Christine's murder. Guy Paul Morin was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. He was sent to Kingston Penitentiary, one of Canada's most notorious prisons. Typically, inmates convicted of sexually assaulting and murdering children are placed in protective custody for their own safety. Other prisoners despise child killers, and violence is common. But Guy Paul Morin was kept in general population. His requests for isolation were rejected. He was surrounded by violent offenders who knew exactly what he'd been convicted of. It should have been the end of the story. Guy Paul Morin, convicted murderer, would spend the rest of his life in prison. The Jessop family could finally have closure. But something remarkable was about to happen. A group of concerned citizens, convinced that Guy was innocent, formed the Justice for Guy Paul Morin Committee immediately after his conviction. And then, in an almost unprecedented move, Guy Paul Morin was released on bail on February 9, 1993, pending his appeal. Bail for a convicted murderer? Almost unheard of. But public opinion was beginning to shift. People were starting to question whether the right man had been convicted. The media, which had initially portrayed Guy as a dangerous monster, began investigating the case and discovering serious problems with the prosecution's evidence. The lost evidence, the contaminated fibers, the deals made with jailhouse informants, the timeline that didn't quite work, the alternative suspects police had ignored, and then there was the DNA evidence. Remember those semen stains found on Christine's underwear? Police had attempted to test them multiple times, but the sample was degraded and the technology of the 1980s and early 90s wasn't sophisticated enough to extract a usable DNA profile. But by 1994, DNA technology had advanced significantly, and Guy Paul Morin's defense team requested that the evidence be tested again. The Crown agreed. If the DNA matched Guy Paul Morin, it would confirm his guilt beyond any doubt. And if it didn't match, well, they were confident it would match. The sample was sent to a laboratory in Boston that specialized in extracting DNA from degraded evidence. On January 19, 1995, defense lawyer James Lockyer received the results. The DNA extracted from the semen on Christine Jessop's underwear could not have come from Guy Paul Morin. It was a match probability of 1 in 9 trillion. Guy Paul Morin was conclusively, scientifically, absolutely innocent. 4 days later, on January 23, 1995, Chief Justice Charles Dubin of the Ontario Court of Appeal entered a directed verdict of acquittal. The conviction was overturned. The charges were withdrawn. Guy Paul Morin was a free man. Crown Counsel Ken Campbell, who had prosecuted Guy Paul Morin at both trials, took the unusual step of shaking Morin's hand in court and expressing his deepest regret. Standing outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and cameras, Guy Paul Morin spoke to the nation. "I did not kill Christine Jessop. It's as simple as that. And finally, DNA has exonerated me 100%. It could happen to you." The justice system has acted in a criminal way. Guy Paul Morin had spent nearly a decade under suspicion, went through 2 trials, spent time in a maximum security prison, and lived next door to a family that believed he'd murdered their daughter. He'd lost 10 years of his life. His reputation was destroyed. His name was synonymous with a heinous crime he didn't commit. And somewhere out there, Christine Jessop's real killer was walking free. But Guy Paul Morin's nightmare was about to serve a greater purpose. His wrongful conviction would expose systemic failures in Canadian law enforcement and forensic science so catastrophic that they would force an entire nation to confront its broken justice system. We'll get to that. But first, if you're invested in this story and want to see how Genealogy finally cracked this case 36 years later, make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Desk. Hit that notification bell. And drop a like if you appreciate the depth of research we put into every documentary. Now, let's talk about how Canada decided to investigate exactly what went wrong. When Guy Paul Morin walked out of that courthouse in January 1995, exonerated by DNA evidence, Canadians were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their justice system had nearly destroyed an innocent man's life. But Guy Paul Morin wasn't the only wrongful conviction making headlines. Donald Marshall Jr. had been wrongfully convicted of murder in Nova Scotia. David Milgaard had spent 23 years in prison in Saskatchewan for a rape and murder he didn't commit. A pattern was emerging, and the pattern was terrifying. On June 26, 1996, the Ontario government established the Commission on Proceedings involving Guy Paul Morin. The Commission's mandate: investigate exactly how an innocent man was twice convicted of murder and recommend reforms to prevent it from happening again. To lead this inquiry, Ontario appointed Fred Kaufman, Queen's Counsel, a former judge of the Quebec Court of Appeal. Kaufman was an extraordinary choice for this role. Born in Vienna, Austria, in 1924 to a Jewish family, he'd fled Nazi Austria at age 15 via the Kindertransport, one of the rescue efforts that saved thousands of Jewish children from the Holocaust. When Kaufman arrived in Canada, he was declared an enemy alien and spent time in internment camps before being released in 1942. Despite this traumatic beginning, he became a lawyer, served as the second editor-in-chief of the McGill Law Journal, and eventually spent 18 years on the Quebec Court of Appeal. He understood injustice. He understood what happens when systems fail to protect the innocent. And he approached the Guy Paul Morin case with methodical thoroughness that would produce one of the most important documents in Canadian legal history. The inquiry ran for 146 days. Commissioner Kaufman called 120 witnesses. His team reviewed more than 100,000 pages of documents, police reports, forensic analyses, trial transcripts, and investigative files. Guy Paul Morin attended every single day of the inquiry. He sat in the hearing room, listening to testimony about how police had built a case against him using worthless evidence, how forensic scientists had hidden contamination problems, how jailhouse informants had fabricated confessions, how investigators had manipulated witnesses into changing their testimony. The final report was released April 9, 1998. It spanned 1,380 pages across 2 volumes and contained 119 specific recommendations for reforming the Canadian criminal justice system. It was a devastating indictment of nearly every part of the investigation and prosecution. Commissioner Kaufman's central finding was stark and unambiguous. An innocent person was convicted of a heinous crime he did not commit. Science helped convict him. Science exonerated him. The report introduced a term that would become central to discussions of wrongful conviction: tunnel vision. Kaufman defined it as a single-minded and overly narrow focus on a particular investigative or prosecutorial theory, so as to unreasonably color the evaluation of information received and one's conduct in response to that information. Once police decided Guy Paul Morin was guilty, they interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens. Evidence that pointed toward guilt was emphasized. Evidence that pointed toward innocence was minimized or ignored. Alternative suspects were dismissed without thorough investigation. The fiber and hair evidence? Commissioner Kaufman ruled it was essentially valueless. He wrote, "Worthless evidence plus worthless evidence plus worthless evidence may still logically amount to a worthless case, but it may not be properly evaluated as such by the trier of fact." In other words, when you pile up enough weak evidence, it can create an illusion of strength. But weak evidence doesn't become strong just because there's a lot of it. The contamination of evidence at the center of forensic sciences was particularly damning. 2 CFS scientists knew about the contamination by purplish-pink animal hairs from a lab technician's Angora sweater. They knew this contamination could have compromised the fiber evidence used to convict Guy Paul Morin, but they didn't disclose it to the defense. They kept it secret. And when questions were raised years later, the CFS claimed the evidence samples had been lost. The Kaufman report concluded that the CFS had failed in its fundamental duty to provide objective, unbiased forensic analysis. Scientists had become advocates for the prosecution rather than neutral experts seeking the truth. The jailhouse informants? The report described their testimony as patently unreliable. Both informants were motivated by self-interest, received leniency deals in exchange for testimony, and had serious credibility problems. Robert Dean May, who'd claimed Guy Paul Morin confessed to him, was later diagnosed as a pathological liar. In 2001, he was declared a dangerous offender and given an indefinite sentence for terrorizing women. Mr. X had a personality disorder with sociopathic tendencies and a criminal history that included sexual offenses. These were the witnesses whose testimony helped convict Guy Paul Morin. The manipulation of the timeline was perhaps the most disturbing finding. Kaufman concluded that police interviewing techniques had distorted Janet and Kenneth Jessop's recollections of when they arrived home. Kenneth Jessop testified emotionally at the inquiry that police had essentially brainwashed the family. He looked directly at Guy Paul Morin and apologized. "I'm sorry, Paul." But one of the most shocking revelations in the Kaufman report involved alternative suspects that police never properly investigated. Calvin Hoover's name appeared more than once in the homicide case file. His wife Heather had been interviewed the day after Christine's disappearance. Police knew the Hoovers were close friends of the Jessop family. They knew Calvin worked with Bob Jessop. They knew Calvin was home the morning Janet made phone calls about visiting Bob in jail. But Calvin Hoover was never questioned, never investigated, never even interviewed. The report noted that Durham Regional Police, which had taken over the investigation after Christine's body was found in their jurisdiction, had largely disregarded York Regional Police's preliminary work, deeming it amateurish and a waste of time. In their rush to focus on Guy Paul Morin, multiple police forces had failed to conduct basic investigative procedures. They hadn't systematically investigated Christine's family and friends. They hadn't thoroughly checked alibis. They hadn't followed up on every potential lead. Commissioner Kaufman wrote, The Durham Regional Police Service investigation was focused on gathering evidence against Guy Paul Morin and effectively closed off other avenues of investigation. This was tunnel vision in its purest form. The Kaufman report produced 119 specific recommendations for reform. These recommendations would fundamentally reshape how Canada investigates crimes, analyzes forensic evidence, and conducts prosecutions. The Centre of Forensic Sciences established a quality unit in 1996 to ensure proper evidence handling and prevent contamination. The center developed strict protocols for communication between lab personnel and investigators to prevent bias. Hair comparison analysis, which had been used to help convict Guy Paul Morin, was virtually abandoned as unreliable. The technique was too subjective, too prone to error, too easily influenced by confirmation bias. In 2012, the CFS opened a new state-of-the-art facility specifically designed to prevent the kinds of contamination problems that had plagued the Morin case. Ontario's Crown Policy Manual was rewritten to require rigorous, objective assessment of jailhouse informants before they could be used as witnesses. Screening committees of senior prosecutors must now approve the use of any in-custody informant. The Ontario In-Custody Informer Committee was established in 1999 to review every case where the Crown planned to use informant testimony. Video recording of police interviews became standard practice across Canadian law enforcement. No longer could detectives claim a suspect confessed without independent verification. Training programs on cognitive biases and tunnel vision were implemented for police officers, prosecutors, and forensic scientists throughout Canada. The Kaufman report became required reading in law schools and police academies. The impact extended beyond Ontario. The Guy Paul Morin case, along with the wrongful convictions of Donald Marshall Jr. and David Milgaard, inspired the creation of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, known as AIDWC, which later became Innocence Canada. The organization was co-founded by Win Warrer, a passionate advocate for Guy Paul Morin, defense lawyer James Lockyer, who had represented Morin during his DNA appeal, and Reuben Hurricane Carter, the boxer who'd been wrongfully convicted of murder and immortalized in a Bob Dylan song. By 2024, Innocence Canada had helped exonerate 29 individuals. The organization continues to investigate potential wrongful convictions, using many of the lessons learned from the Guy Paul Morin case. On January 24, 1997, 2 years after his exoneration and before the Kaufman report was even released, the Ontario government awarded Guy Paul Morin and his parents $1.25 million in compensation. It was an acknowledgement that the government had destroyed his life. But money couldn't give him back the decade he'd lost. Money couldn't restore his reputation. Money couldn't erase the trauma of being accused of murdering a child, sitting through 2 trials, spending time in a maximum security prison, living next door to a family that believed he was a monster. Guy used some of the money to purchase farmland north of Toronto. He married a member of his support team and eventually had 2 sons. He became a certified piano tuner, continuing his passion for music. He later worked maintenance at Toronto's Pearson International Airport, living a quiet life away from the spotlight. He even produced a compact disc of his clarinet music, a quiet triumph for the musician whose passion for music had made him a target of suspicion. But despite his exoneration, despite the compensation, despite the public acknowledgement that he was innocent, Guy Paul Morin couldn't fully escape the shadow of the Christine Jessop case. As journalist Kirk Macon noted, an acquittal doesn't entirely remove what he called the mark of Cain. There will always be people who wonder, who whisper, who believe the system got it right the first time and DNA testing is somehow fallible. For that mark to be truly erased, for Guy Paul Morin to be completely vindicated, someone else would have to be identified as Christine Jessop's killer. And for 25 years after his exoneration, that didn't happen. The Christine Jessop murder investigation became a cold case. Toronto Police Service, which had jurisdiction because Durham Regional Police had been so thoroughly discredited, assigned detectives to periodically review the files. But they made no progress. The DNA from Christine's underwear was preserved. It represented the killer's genetic fingerprint. But without a match in any criminal database, it was useless. More than 300 potential suspects were examined and ruled out over the years. Dozens of DNA samples were collected from people who'd lived in Queensville in October 1984, people who'd known the Jessop family, people who'd been flagged for any reason. None of them matched. Detective Sergeant Stacy Gallant led the cold case squad and maintained regular contact with Janet Jessop. He spoke with her 3 or 4 times a year, updating her on the investigation, assuring her that the case hadn't been forgotten. But privately, investigators worried they might never identify Christine's killer. The trail was decades old. Memories had faded. Evidence had been lost or contaminated. Key witnesses had died. Janet and Bob Jessop both feared they wouldn't live to see their daughter's killer identified. The years dragged on. 2005, 2010, 2015. And then, in December 2019, something changed. Detective Sergeant Stacy Gallant was approaching retirement. He'd spent years working the Christine Jessop case, reviewing files, following dead-end leads, speaking with Janet Jessop about her daughter. Days before he was scheduled to retire, Gallant submitted a proposal to his superiors. He wanted to try something new, something revolutionary, something that had just recently been used to catch the Golden State Killer in California. Genetic genealogy. The technique had been developed by private companies offering ancestry DNA testing. People would submit saliva samples to services like 23andMe or Ancestry.com, and the company would analyze their DNA to tell them about their ethnic background and connect them with distant relatives. By 2019, millions of people had uploaded their DNA to these databases. And genealogists realized something remarkable. You could use this data to solve crimes. If you had a DNA sample from a crime scene, you could upload it to a public genealogy database and find distant relatives of the suspect. Then, by carefully building family trees and identifying where those family trees intersected, you could narrow down the list of potential suspects to a handful of people. It had worked brilliantly to identify the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who terrorized California in the 1970s and 80s. Law enforcement had submitted his DNA to a public database called GIDmatch, found distant relatives, built elaborate family trees, and eventually identified Joseph James D'Angelo as the killer. Gallant believed the same technique could work for the Christine Jessop case. They had excellent DNA evidence from the semen on her underwear. It was degraded, yes, but modern technology could work with degraded samples. The proposal was approved quickly. This was a high-profile cold case. If genetic genealogy could identify Christine's killer after 36 years, it would be a major victory for Toronto police and bring closure to the Jessop family. The degraded DNA sample was sent to Othram Incorporated, a laboratory in Houston, Texas, that specialized in human identification from difficult DNA evidence. Othram had developed proprietary techniques for extracting usable genetic profiles from samples that other labs considered too degraded to analyze. Othram successfully extracted a DNA profile from the semen on Christine's underwear. That profile was then uploaded to 2 public genetic genealogy databases, GIDmatch and Family Tree DNA. These databases contain genetic information voluntarily shared by people interested in tracing their ancestry and connecting with distant relatives. By comparing the killer's DNA to the millions of profiles in these databases, investigators could identify people who shared portions of DNA with the killer. Those people would be distant relatives, second cousins, third cousins, maybe fourth cousins twice removed. People who had no idea they were related to a murderer, but whose DNA could provide crucial clues. The investigation was assigned to Anthony Redgrave, a forensic genealogist based in Athol, Massachusetts. Redgrave led a team of 6 researchers who specialized in building complex family trees from genetic data. Their task was monumentally difficult. Take the DNA matches found in the databases. Build family trees for each of those matches going back several generations. Identify where those family trees intersected. Then work forward through the generations, tracking every descendant of those common ancestors. Somewhere in those family trees would be the killer. The process took approximately 6 months. The team worked methodically, carefully, following paper trails through birth records, marriage certificates, census data, obituaries, anything that could help them trace family connections. One of the DNA matches that proved crucial came from a retired Toronto software developer named Ken. He was a passionate genealogy enthusiast who'd uploaded his DNA to ancestry sites hoping to learn about his family history and connect with distant relatives. Ken had no idea he was unknowingly a second cousin once removed to Christine Jessop's killer. He only learned of his role when contacted by CBC after the case was solved. But his DNA was the key connection. By building Ken's family tree backward through generations and then forward through all the descendants, the genealogists could narrow down the list of potential suspects. By early August 2020, the team had focused on one specific family. They'd studied hundreds of individuals descended from a common ancestor born in 1804. They'd tracked the family through multiple generations, across different provinces, through marriages and children and deaths. And on August 7, 2020, Anthony Redgrave submitted a name to Toronto police as a candidate for identification, Calvin Hoover. The detective assigned to the case was Steve Smith. When he saw the name, he didn't immediately recognize it. He went back through the case files, searching for any mention of Calvin Hoover. What he found shocked him. Calvin Hoover's name appeared multiple times in the files. His wife Heather had been interviewed the day after Christine's disappearance. The Hoovers were identified as close friends of the Jessop family. Calvin worked with Bob Jessop. The families socialized together. But Calvin Hoover himself had never been questioned, never investigated, never even briefly interviewed. Detective Smith began researching Calvin Hoover's background. What he discovered was both revealing and disturbing. Calvin Hoover was 28 years old in October 1984. He worked as a cable installer for Eastern Independent Telecom, the same company where Bob Jessop worked. The two men were work colleagues and personal friends. Calvin's wife Heather and Janet Jessop were close. The women talked regularly, shared coffee, watched each other's children. Heather even had a school photo of Christine on her wall for years after the murder. The Jessop and Hoover families socialized together. Christine had visited the Hoover home just 2 nights before she disappeared. Kenneth Jessop remembered that Calvin used to babysit them when they were little. On the morning of October 3, 1984, Janet Jessop made a phone call to Heather Hoover. During this call, Christine could be heard in the background crying because she wanted to go visit her father in jail. Janet explained that she'd be taking Kenneth to the dentist and then to see Bob, but Christine was too young for the jail visit. Calvin Hoover was home during this phone call. He was in the room. He heard the conversation. He knew Christine would be home alone that afternoon. Detective Smith also learned that Calvin Hoover was familiar with the area where Christine's body was found near Sunderland, Ontario. The Hoover family had a cabin in the vicinity. Calvin had friends who lived nearby. He would have known the wooded areas, the isolated trails, the places where a body could be hidden. After Christine's murder, Calvin Hoover participated in the search for her body. He attended her funeral at St. Mary's Anglican Church. He went to the Jessop family home afterward for the wake, expressing his condolences, hugging Janet, offering support. He'd been there the entire time, hiding in plain sight. But there was a significant problem with this revelation. Calvin Hoover was dead. He died by suicide in 2015 at his home in Port Hope, Ontario. His son had found him after returning from a wedding. Hoover had used carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. For a moment, Detective Smith thought the case might still be unsolvable. You can't prosecute a dead man. And if Hoover was dead, how could they get a DNA sample to confirm he was the killer? But then Smith learned something that changed everything. When someone dies unexpectedly, even from apparent suicide, a medical examiner performs an autopsy. Blood samples are typically taken and preserved in case questions arise later. Smith contacted the medical examiners who'd handled Hoover's case. And incredibly, they still had 2 vials of his blood. Those vials were sent to the lab. DNA was extracted from the blood, and it was compared to the DNA profile from the semen found on Christine Jessop's underwear. The DNA matched conclusively. The match probability was beyond dispute. Calvin Hoover was, without any doubt, the person who sexually assaulted and murdered Christine Jessop on October 3, 1984. October 15, 2020. Toronto Police Headquarters. Interim Chief James Raymer stood before a room full of reporters and cameras, preparing to make an announcement that would close one of Canada's most notorious cold cases. 36 years after Christine Jessop's murder. 25 years after Guy Paul Morin's exoneration. The truth was finally going to be revealed. Raymer began. If he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the murder of Christine Jessop. The room erupted with questions. Calvin Hoover? Who was Calvin Hoover? Why had it taken 36 years to identify him? Detective Steve Smith provided more details. Calvin Hoover is the only person in the world forensically linked to that extent to this crime. The DNA match is conclusive. Smith explained the genetic genealogy process that had led to Hoover's identification. How Othram had extracted DNA from degraded evidence. How the profile was uploaded to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA. How forensic genealogist Anthony Redgrave and his team had spent 6 months building family trees and narrowing down suspects. And then came the most shocking detail. Calvin Hoover had been a close family friend of the Jessops. Chief Raymer addressed this directly. Calvin Hoover was among a select group who knew that Christine would be home alone on October 3, 1984. He'd heard Janet's phone call to his wife that morning. He'd known Christine would be home unsupervised. He'd known she trusted him because he was a family friend. He'd used that trust to lure her away. Raymer emphasized, there are no winners in this announcement. This is not a victory. This is simply a step forward toward justice for Christine Jessop. That morning, before the press conference, 2 police officers had gone to Guy Paul Morin's home to deliver the news personally. After 25 years of wondering if Christine's real killer would ever be identified, Guy finally had his answer. Through his lawyer James Lockyer, Guy released a statement. I am relieved for Christine's mother, Janet, and her family, and hope this will give them some peace of mind. They have been through a dreadful ordeal for 36 years since they lost Christine in 1984. When DNA exonerated me in January 1995, I was sure that one day DNA would reveal the real killer, and now it has. The justice system failed me, but science saved me. Detective Steve Smith had traveled personally to deliver the news to Janet Jessop. At 83 years old, after spending more than half her life wondering who killed her daughter, Janet finally had an answer. In her interview with CBC, her voice trembling with emotion, Janet said, I am very glad that it's over now. The end has come. We have now some closure. And that was very, very important to get. For the first time in 36 years, I won't go to bed praying to find out who killed my daughter. It's a miracle. I can't find another word for it. Kenneth Jessop, Christine's brother, expressed a complex mix of emotions in his interview with reporters. Relief that we finally have the answer we waited for. Angry about who it is. Frustrated. Sad. Like anything in this case, Heather Hoover, Calvin's ex-wife who'd been close friends with Janet Jessop, released a statement through CBC. We are all devastated by the announcement made this week. Our hearts go out to the Jessop family. In a later interview, Heather admitted, I was devastated, totally shocked. That type of DNA don't lie. There's only one way it got there, and that just don't lie. She reflected on the years she'd spent married to Calvin, raising their children, socializing with the Jessops, never suspecting that her husband had murdered her friend's daughter. I've thought many times things could be so different. If I had known way back then, if the cops had done their job a little better. Little did we know, he was right under our thumbs. Heather had been interviewed by police the day after Christine disappeared. She'd told them Calvin was home that day watching their children. She'd provided him an alibi without even realizing what she was doing. And police had never followed up. Never questioned Calvin himself. Never investigated the family friend who had opportunity, access, and knowledge that Christine would be alone. As journalists dug into Calvin Hoover's background, a disturbing picture emerged of a man whose life slowly unraveled after Christine's murder. Those who knew Calvin observed a dramatic change in his behavior after Guy Paul Morin's DNA exoneration in January 1995. Suddenly, everyone knew that Christine's real killer's DNA was on file with police. It was only a matter of time before technology improved enough to identify him. Calvin's drinking increased significantly in the mid to late 1990s. He became a constant presence at local pubs, according to investigation findings. Friends described him as a nervous and anxious man who couldn't hold his liquor very well. His behavior became increasingly erratic. In one disturbing incident in the mid-1990s, while drinking with friends, Calvin pulled out a pocket knife and began carving into a kitchen table. The action made people around him uncomfortable, but nobody said anything. His marriage to Heather collapsed. By 1996, they downsized to low-rent housing in Ajax, Ontario. Calvin was convicted of impaired driving that year, his first and only criminal conviction. He remarried in 2004, but his second wife, Joan, died in 2009. Calvin lived alone in Port Hope, Ontario, working sporadically, drinking heavily, becoming increasingly isolated. In 2015, Calvin Hoover committed suicide in his garage using carbon monoxide poisoning. He was 59 years old. His son found him when returning from a wedding. Did Calvin kill himself because he couldn't live with the guilt? Because he knew advances in DNA technology would eventually identify him? We'll never know. But Detective Steve Smith told reporters that police were now examining Calvin Hoover's entire life, looking at every unsolved case from areas where he'd lived and worked. We're running his DNA through every database we have access to, Smith said. Canada, United States, United Kingdom. We need to know if he's connected to any other crimes. So far, no other matches have been found. But the investigation continues. The genetic genealogy technique that identified Calvin Hoover represented a revolutionary development in criminal investigation. It was only the second major case in Canada solved using this method, after the 1975 murder of 15-year-old Sharon Pryor in Quebec. But the technique also raised significant privacy concerns. When people upload their DNA to ancestry websites, they're typically looking to learn about their ethnic background or connect with distant relatives. They're not expecting their genetic information to be used to solve crimes. Civil liberties advocates have expressed concern about the implications. If police can use these databases to identify criminals through their distant relatives, what's to stop them from using the same technique for other purposes? The debate continues. But for the Jessop family, the ethical questions were secondary to the relief of finally knowing who killed Christine. As news of Calvin Hoover's identification spread across Canada, reaction was swift and intense. Many people expressed anger that police had failed to properly investigate Hoover in 1984 and 85. He was right there in the case files. His wife was interviewed. He was identified as a close family friend. He had opportunity and access. How had every police force working the case missed him? Commissioner Fred Kaufman's report had documented the tunnel vision that led investigators to focus exclusively on Guy Paul Morin while ignoring alternative suspects. Calvin Hoover was the perfect example of that failure. Kirk Macon, a journalist who'd covered the case extensively, wrote, "The most junior cadet is aware that homicide investigations begin with family and friends and radiate outward in concentric circles. How, then, did Calvin Hoover escape any investigative scrutiny whatsoever?" The answer was painful, because police were so convinced Guy Paul Morin was guilty that they stopped investigating anyone else. Others focused on the redemptive power of science. DNA testing had exonerated Guy Paul Morin in 1995. Genetic genealogy had identified the real killer in 2020. Science had both failed and ultimately saved the day. Guy Paul Morin himself addressed this in his statement. "The justice system failed me, but science saved me." It was a powerful reminder that forensic science is only as good as the people using it. When used properly, with appropriate skepticism and proper protocols, it can be remarkably powerful. When misused or misapplied, it can destroy innocent lives. The Christine Jessop case had demonstrated both extremes. On October 3, 2024, the 40th anniversary of Christine's disappearance, fresh flowers appeared at her grave in the Queensville cemetery. The flowers had been placed by Janet Jessop. But Janet wouldn't visit that grave again. On March 15, 2024, just 5 months before the anniversary, Janet Jessop passed away at her retirement home in Niagara Falls. She was 87 years old. She'd lived long enough to learn that Calvin Hoover killed her daughter. She'd finally received the answer she'd prayed for every night for 36 years. On October 3, 2024, the 40th anniversary of Christine's disappearance, Janet Jessop was buried alongside her daughter in the Queensville cemetery. The cemetery where Christine used to play. The cemetery behind the house where the Jessop family had lived when Christine was alive. Mother and daughter, finally reunited. Kenneth Jessop continues to honor his sister's memory. He's been sober since March 7, 2022, and credits his recovery partly to finding closure in Christine's case. Kenny creates laser art memorial pieces as therapy and helps others struggling with grief and addiction. He operates a Facebook page called Justice for Christine, where he shares memories of his sister and updates about cold cases. "Christine's case taught me that you never give up," Kenny told an interviewer. "My mother never gave up. Guy Paul Morin never gave up. And eventually, the truth came out. That's the lesson I want people to take from this. Guy Paul Morin largely stays out of the public eye. He's in his mid-60s now, living quietly with his family on farmland north of Toronto. He works at Pearson International Airport, plays his clarinet, and tunes pianos. He's never given an extensive interview about his ordeal. James Lockyer, his lawyer during the DNA appeal, says Guy simply wants to move on with his life. He lost a decade to this case, Lockyer said. He doesn't want to lose any more time dwelling on it. But the impact of Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction continues to resonate through Canadian jurisprudence. His case is studied in law schools, referenced in court decisions, used as the primary example when discussing wrongful convictions. And the reforms triggered by the Kaufman report continue to protect Canadian citizens from similar injustices. If you want to learn more about other cold cases solved through genetic genealogy and DNA breakthroughs, make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Desk. We cover these stories in depth, with thorough research and respect for the victims and families involved. On December 27, 2023, Fred Kaufman, Queen's Counsel, passed away at his home in Montreal at the age of 99. Kaufman had lived an extraordinary life. A Jewish refugee who fled Nazi Austria as a teenager. An internee who was labeled an enemy alien by Canada. A lawyer who became one of the country's most respected jurists. And the commissioner whose inquiry into Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction transformed Canadian criminal justice. His obituaries mention many accomplishments, but the Kaufman report was consistently highlighted as his most significant contribution to Canadian law. The report's 119 recommendations reshaped how police investigate crimes, how forensic scientists analyze evidence, how Crown prosecutors build cases, and how defense lawyers challenge convictions. But the Kaufman report wasn't just about Guy Paul Morin. It was about a larger pattern of wrongful convictions that had plagued Canada for decades. Donald Marshall Jr., a Mi'kmaq man from Nova Scotia, spent 11 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit before being exonerated in 1983. His case exposed systemic racism in the justice system. David Milgaard spent 23 years in prison for the rape and murder of Gail Miller in Saskatoon before DNA evidence proved his innocence in 1997. Thomas Safano was tried 3 times for the murder of Barbara Stoppel before being acquitted and later exonerated. William Mullins Johnson spent 12 years in prison for the supposed murder of his niece before medical evidence proved the child died of natural causes. Romeo Fillion spent 31 years in prison before his conviction for murdering Ottawa firefighter Leopold Roy was overturned. And there were others. Too many others. The creation of the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted, which became Innocence Canada, provided these victims with legal representation and advocacy. By 2024, the organization had helped exonerate 29 individuals. But it's worth asking, how many wrongful convictions are never discovered? How many innocent people are currently sitting in Canadian prisons, convicted of crimes they didn't commit? We know about Guy Paul Morin because DNA evidence proved his innocence. But what about crimes where there is no DNA evidence? What about cases where all the evidence was circumstantial? What about defendants who couldn't afford excellent legal representation? The answer is uncomfortable. We simply don't know. The Kaufman report's recommendations were designed to prevent wrongful convictions before they happen. Better police investigations. More reliable forensic science. Stricter rules about jailhouse informants. Video recording of interrogations. Disclosure requirements that force prosecutors to share all evidence with the defense. These reforms have undoubtedly prevented some wrongful convictions, but they can't prevent all of them. Human beings are fallible. Witnesses make mistakes. Forensic scientists draw incorrect conclusions. Juries get it wrong sometimes. The Christine Jessop case teaches us several crucial lessons about justice, truth, and the limitations of human systems. First, tunnel vision is one of the most dangerous problems in criminal investigations. Once police decided Guy Paul Morin was guilty, they interpreted everything through that lens. His awkward personality became evidence of dangerousness. His passion for music became a tool for luring children. His refusal to confess became evidence of deception rather than innocence. Meanwhile, Calvin Hoover was right there in the case files. Family friend, trusted neighbor, someone who knew Christine would be home alone. someone who had access, opportunity, and motive. But because police had locked on a Guy Paul Morin as their suspect, they never properly investigated Calvin Hoover. They never even questioned him. The Kaufman report emphasized that investigators must remain open to alternative theories throughout an investigation. They must actively seek evidence that contradicts their working hypothesis, not just evidence that confirms it. This is extraordinarily difficult to do. Human beings naturally suffer from confirmation bias. We see what we expect to see. We interpret ambiguous information in ways that support our existing beliefs. Fighting confirmation bias requires conscious effort, institutional checks and balances, and a culture that values truth over closure. Second, forensic science is not infallible. For decades, hair comparison analysis was considered reliable evidence. Experts would testify in court that a hair found at a crime scene was consistent with or microscopically similar to a defendant's hair. The Kaufman report exposed how unreliable this analysis actually was. Human hair analysis is subjective. Different experts examining the same samples often reach different conclusions. And the probative value is extremely limited because millions of people have similar hair characteristics. Yet this evidence helped convict Guy Paul Morin. Similarly, the fiber evidence used at both trials was contaminated and essentially worthless. But it sounded scientific. It sounded definitive. And juries believed it. The lesson: forensic science must be subjected to rigorous standards. Techniques must be validated. Labs must prevent contamination. Scientists must communicate the limitations of their analyses, not just the conclusions. DNA analysis is currently considered the gold standard of forensic evidence. It exonerated Guy Paul Morin. It identified Calvin Hoover. It seems infallible. But even DNA evidence can be mishandled, contaminated, or misinterpreted. We must remain skeptical of all forensic evidence, even techniques that seem bulletproof. Third, jailhouse informants are inherently unreliable. Robert Dean May and Mr. X both testified that Guy Paul Morin confessed to them in jail. Their testimony was compelling. Juries tend to believe that people don't confess to crimes they didn't commit. But both informants were motivated by self-interest. Both received leniency deals. And May was later proven to be a pathological liar. The Kaufman report led to strict controls on the use of jailhouse informant testimony in Canada. Screening committees must approve it. Prosecutors must assess reliability. Courts must give limiting instructions to juries. But these reforms don't exist in every jurisdiction. And even with reforms, jailhouse informant testimony continues to contribute to wrongful convictions. The fundamental problem is that people in custody have strong incentives to lie. If fabricating a confession can lead to reduced charges or early release, some people will do it without hesitation. Fourth, witness memory is fallible and malleable. Janet and Kenneth Jessop originally testified they arrived home at 4:10 p.m. on October 3rd. They were certain of this. But after months of repeated questioning by police suggesting they might be wrong, both changed their testimony to 4:35 p.m. This wasn't intentional deception. The Jessops genuinely wanted to help catch their daughter's killer. When authority figures told them their memory might be wrong, they deferred to the experts. But this change in timeline was crucial to the prosecution's case. It gave Guy Paul Morin enough time, theoretically, to commit the crime. The lesson: witness memory is extraordinarily unreliable, especially for details like exact times. And repeated questioning can actually change memories rather than clarify them. Modern interrogation techniques try to account for these problems. Video recording helps establish what was actually said. Open-ended questions are preferred over leading questions. But the fundamental fragility of human memory remains a serious problem for the justice system. Fifth, the importance of DNA databases and genetic genealogy. If Toronto police hadn't preserved the semen from Christine's underwear for 36 years, Calvin Hoover would never have been identified. If Othram hadn't developed techniques for extracting DNA from degraded samples, the evidence would have been useless. If millions of people hadn't voluntarily uploaded their DNA to ancestry websites, genetic genealogy couldn't have worked. All of these factors had to align for the case to be solved. The Christine Jessop case was only the second major cold case in Canada solved through genetic genealogy. Since then, the technique has been used successfully in numerous investigations across North America. But But genetic genealogy raises serious privacy concerns. When you upload your DNA to an ancestry website, you're not just sharing your own genetic information. You're potentially implicating your relatives, including distant relatives you've never met. The retired Toronto software developer named Ken, who provided the crucial genetic link to Calvin Hoover, had no idea his DNA would be used to solve a murder. He was simply interested in genealogy. Is this ethical? Should police have access to these databases? Should ancestry companies warn users that their genetic information might be used in criminal investigations? These are difficult questions without easy answers. Privacy advocates worry about genetic surveillance and the potential for abuse. Law enforcement argues that solving violent crimes justifies the intrusion. The debate will continue. But what's clear is that genetic genealogy has permanently changed criminal investigation. Cold cases that were considered unsolvable can now potentially be cracked with enough time and resources. Sixth, the personal cost of wrongful conviction is incalculable. Guy Paul Morin received $1.25 million in compensation. But money couldn't give him back the decade he lost. He was arrested at age 25, just as his life was beginning. He spent 10 months in jail awaiting his first trial. He endured 2 lengthy trials. He was convicted and sent to maximum security prison. He lived under suspicion for years. Even after his DNA exoneration, some people continued to believe he was guilty. He had to rebuild his life from scratch. Find work, date, eventually marry, have children, all while carrying the stigma of having been convicted of murdering a child. Guy Paul Morin's life was irreparably damaged by his wrongful conviction. No amount of compensation can fix that, and he's one of the lucky ones. He was eventually exonerated. Many wrongfully convicted people never are. The Jessop family also suffered incalculable harm. They lost their daughter to a brutal murder. Then they spent 36 years not knowing who killed her. They were told repeatedly that their neighbor was the killer. They believed it. They lived next door to the Morin family, unable to move, unable to escape the daily reminder. And when Guy was exonerated, they had to confront the reality that they'd been wrong, that they'd blamed an innocent man, that Christine's real killer was still out there. Kenneth Jessop publicly apologized to Guy Paul Morin during the Kaufman inquiry. It was an emotional moment captured in transcripts and news reports. Kenny stood in the witness box, looked directly at Guy, and said, "I'm sorry, Paul. We believed what we were told." The Jessops learned in 2020 that their trusted family friend Calvin Hoover had murdered Christine, someone they'd invited into their home, someone who'd attended the funeral, someone who'd hugged them and offered condolences while knowing exactly what he'd done. That betrayal compounded their trauma in ways that are difficult to comprehend. Seventh, justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. It took 36 years to identify Christine Jessop's killer. By the time police made the identification, Calvin Hoover was already dead. He was never arrested, never tried, never convicted, never punished. Some people might argue this means justice was never served. Hoover escaped accountability. He lived his life freely for 3 decades while Guy Paul Morin suffered for a crime he didn't commit. But for the Jessop family, finally knowing the truth was a form of justice. Janet Jessop died knowing who killed her daughter. Kenneth Jessop has closure. Guy Paul Morin was vindicated. The truth matters, even when it comes decades late. And the case led to systemic reforms that have protected other innocent people from wrongful conviction. That's a form of justice too. The original Jessop home on Leslie Street in Queensville is now a Montessori school. The old farmhouse is filled with children's laughter, art projects, playground equipment. It's a place of joy and learning. Through the cedar trees at the back of the property, you can see the Queensville cemetery where Christine Marion Jessop is buried, where she used to play as a child, completely unafraid, in a town where nothing bad was supposed to happen. On quiet days, if you visit the cemetery, you'll often find fresh flowers on Christine's grave. Sometimes they're from Kenneth Jessop. Sometimes from community members who never met Christine but remember her story. In October 2024, on the 40th anniversary of Christine's disappearance, fresh flowers appeared with a note. "We never met you, but we know people who knew and loved you. May your beautiful soul finally rest in peace." Guy Paul Morin doesn't visit the cemetery. He's moved on with his life as much as anyone can move on from such an experience. But those who know him say he thinks about Christine Jessop often. About the little girl whose murder set in motion a nightmare that consumed a decade of his life. He said privately that he hopes Christine's case prevents other wrongful convictions. That the reforms triggered by the Kaufman report will protect other innocent people from suffering what he suffered. That would be Christine's legacy. A 9-year-old girl who loved baseball and dreamed of being a veterinarian, whose tragic death exposed catastrophic failures in Canada's justice system and forced an entire nation to confront how wrong things can go. The Christine Jessop case is studied in law schools across Canada. It's referenced in countless court decisions, academic papers, and policy documents. It's used to train police officers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, and judges. Every Canadian law student learns about Guy Paul Morin's wrongful conviction. They study the Kaufman report. They discuss tunnel vision, confirmation bias, unreliable forensic science, and jailhouse informants. And they learn that the justice system, for all its importance, is a human institution with human flaws. It can fail. It does fail. And when it fails, innocent people suffer catastrophically. The best we can do is remain vigilant. Question assumptions. Demand rigorous evidence. Protect the rights of the accused. And never forget that behind every case are real people whose lives hang in the balance. Christine Marion Jessop was real. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She had dreams and fears and favorite toys. She played in cemeteries and rode her bike through quiet streets. She wanted to be a veterinarian. Guy Paul Morin was real. He was someone's son, someone's brother. He loved music and kept bees. He was awkward and eccentric, but fundamentally decent. He became the target of one of the worst miscarriages of justice in Canadian history. Calvin Hoover was real. He was someone's husband, someone's father, someone's friend. He worked alongside Bob Jessop. He attended barbecues with the Jessop family. He heard a phone call one October morning and decided to do something monstrous. These are not abstract legal principles. These are human beings whose lives intersected in the worst possible way on October 3rd, 1984. On that ordinary Wednesday afternoon in Queensville, Ontario, in a town where everyone knew everyone and nobody locked their doors, a 9-year-old girl got off a school bus carrying a plastic recorder. She was excited to show her family. She stopped at the corner store for bubble gum. And then she encountered someone she trusted. Someone her family trusted. And everything changed. Her mother spent 36 years wondering what happened. Her brother spent 36 years seeking answers. An innocent man spent 10 years under suspicion and the rest of his life carrying the stigma. But finally, through the combination of preserved evidence, advancing technology, and determined investigators, the truth emerged. Calvin Hoover murdered Christine Jessop. It wasn't the weird neighbor who played clarinet. It wasn't a stranger who grabbed her off the street. It was a family friend who knew she'd be home alone and used that knowledge to commit an unspeakable crime. And now we know. 36 years later, we know. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that truth matters. Justice matters. And we must never stop seeking both, no matter how long it takes. Christine Jessop's case is now closed. The real killer has been identified. Guy Paul Morin has been vindicated. The Jessop family has closure. But the legacy of this case will continue for generations. Every time a Canadian police officer investigates a crime and consciously fights against tunnel vision, that's Christine's legacy. Every time a forensic scientist refuses to overstate the certainty of their conclusions, that's Christine's legacy. Every time a prosecutor carefully evaluates the reliability of a jailhouse informant, that's Christine's legacy. And every time an innocent person avoids wrongful conviction because of the reforms triggered by this case, that's Christine's legacy too. A 9-year-old girl who loved life, whose life was stolen, whose death changed a nation. Rest in peace, Christine Marion Jessop. Your story has been told. The truth has been revealed. And you will not be forgotten. Before we close, I want to thank you for watching this comprehensive documentary on the Christine Jessop case. Here at Cold Case Desk, we put countless hours of research into every video, ensuring accuracy, respect for victims and families, and thorough investigation of every angle. If you found this documentary valuable, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We cover cold cases from around the world, always with the depth and detail they deserve. Leave a like if you appreciate the work that goes into these investigations. And share your thoughts in the comments. Did you know about the Christine Jessop case before this video? What shocked you most about this story? What lessons do you think we should take from this tragedy? Thank you for spending this time learning about Christine Jessop, Guy Paul Morin, and one of the most important cases in Canadian legal history. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop seeking the truth. This has been Cold Case Desk.